Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, patrons, friends, and our very special guest tonight, Her Majesty's Coastguard, Lymington Station. We have an exhibition celebrating the 200th anniversary of the Coastguard, hence their presence here tonight. I would like to thank the Coastguard very much. They have been enormously helpful in putting the exhibition together. I've never curated a thing in my life before, so they've been enormously helpful, particularly Colin. And look forward to the next 6 weeks when it's in the McCarthy Room, free of charge. On Saturdays there'll be children's activities, so do bring your children, grandchildren along. This is how it all started about September last year when somebody said to me, when you're thinking of next year's talks, it's the 200th anniversary of the Coastguard. So by a roundabout route, I got in touch with Colin, who's the station officer here in Lymington, and the small acorn has grown into a complete oak tree. It's a full exhibition now. So it's been great fun working with them. We had a terrific laugh on Wednesday, getting our very shabby dummy up on the wall, looking like a smart coastguard, but he's been redeemed. He was once Bob the smuggler, then he was Bob the pirate, and now he's fully redeemed and he's a coastguard. So tonight, to introduce the exhibition, John Astbury and James Hoare, who's hiding over there, are going to talk about the 200 years of the Coastguard, how it began. So John's going to take you through the history, and then James, I think, is going to talk about today and some war stories. So Dr. John Astbury, CBE, is a patron of St Barbe and also volunteers in the King Research Room, so we know him quite well. But in a previous life, he started work as a lad on the watch at the Needles, and he rose to become Chief Executive of the Maritime and Coastguard Agency and Chief Coastguard all at once. So I think you reported to yourself, didn't you? Anyway, now he's in retirement. He's a lecturer at Middlesex University Business School and at St Barbe. James, you may know in another life as Mayor of our town. And he's a Coastguard rescue officer, so he works with these guys down here. And you may notice when he's facing you that he, like a lot of the brass buttons in front of me, are sporting a brass badge here. And that's their commendation for bravery at the Valentine's Night Rescue in 2014 in Milford. So we're very proud of you guys. Thank you for everything you do for us, and your partners, who presumably enable it all to happen. And John, I will hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. You're right. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Prue. Run BT. I've been waiting to say that for years.
Coastguard Rescue. Coastguard.
ATC clearance received. ETA 10 minutes. Casualty located. Proceed to the beach. Approaching into prepared winch.
Okay, well, after that dramatic introduction, and I'm going to talk to you about the start of the Coastguard 200 years ago. And before I get heckled, no, I wasn't there at the start. James is going to give you an update about how the Coastguard features now, particularly with an emphasis on the Lymington Coastguard, and also the wider picture on the modern Coastguard service. So you, hopefully in the next 45 minutes or so, you'll get a good overview of where we're at and where we came from. But of course, we can't possibly cram 200 years into that space of time. So please forgive me if I'm rather brief on some aspects of the history. Before I launch into the last 200 years, I need to explain an important difference between the Coastguard and the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, because there's a lot of confusion out there about who does what, when and why. The RNLI is a charity formed in 1824, 2 years after the Coastguard, and it doesn't receive any funds from the government, and it wishes to remain that way, so I understand. The Coastguard, on the other hand, is not a charity, although some people try to think it is, and is funded by the taxpayer. The RNLI is different, but it has a related story, and I'm sure they would be delighted to speak on that subject in 2 years' time. First, I need to give you a precursor to put HM Coastguard history into context. So, the situation that we had before the formal formation of Her Majesty's Coastguard, or BC, as I would call it, before Coastguard, those responsible for guarding the coast were more interested in the cargo than the crew, and there is anecdotal evidence to suggest that there were many smugglers amongst those in the ranks and officers of the Coastguard. It's not the same today, of course, it's completely different. You'll have heard stories about Lymington smugglers, and in particular the Nag's Head over the road and the Angel Inn on the opposite sides of the High Street. Interestingly, a lady called Jane Bays was the landlady of the Nag's Head during the smuggling era. She also worked in the Lymington Excise Office, responsible for ships' imports and exports, and I leave you to consider the implications of that. There is said to be a smuggler's tunnel from the Angel cellar to the Nag's Head, but I've never come across it. And I went down into the Nag's Head cellar some years ago, before it was the boots, not Specsavers, what do they call it now? Ophthalmologist or whatever. It's easy for me to say. Yeah, it's now Boots Opticians, but I'm unsure whether that's true. And I've read a few books on the subject, and people tell me that, well, no, there's no truth in it. But you never know, do you? Never know. As we know, in the early 18th and 19th century, smuggling was a key part of business and the economy of Lymington and the New Forest, enjoyed by all classes of society and known as free trading. It was encouraged by the high taxes imposed to pay for costly wars in Europe, which often left the rural population close to starvation. This illegal trade grew rapidly, and by mid-18th century, 80% of tea was smuggled. Not surprising, as a pound of China tea with duty would cost almost £200 in today's money. Once under cover of the forest, smugglers knew that their contraband was safe. Armed with pistols and swords, they would confront anyone who stood in their way, including preventative officers. Free trade in the sheltered Lymington River brought considerable wealth and the building of many fine houses. I just wonder whether some of you are actually living in them today. The Coastguard could do little, were indeed, and most of them were actually involved in it. Daniel Defoe wrote of Lymington that its waterfront was teeming with smugglers and all sorts of desperados. There's no foreign commerce except what we call smuggling and roguing. So, has there been any change in 200 years? Rudyard Kipling captured this activity well with his poem, 5 and 20 Ponies Trotting Through the Dark, brandy for the parson and baccy for the clerk, laces for the ladies, letters for a spy, watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by. Smugglers came from a cast of hundreds from all parts of society, so it was difficult to identify smugglers as everyone in the society actually played a part in it. You wouldn't know who was a smuggler and who was somebody else. They had terms, as in all these things, like in Facebook and things like that nowadays. The smugglers had terms for people. An adventurer was a wealthy landowner, provided cash to buy goods in France. Captain of the fast armed boats capable of outrunning revenue cutters. Much the same nowadays with smugglers, actually. A lander, his team of locals, earned a week's pay for a night's work. Tubmen, who handled contraband in tubs concealed in smugglers' boats, and batmen, armed with cudgels and muskets to collect and hide tubs. And of course, New Forest ponies, who moved goods quickly out of sight of the revenue. And the clients who provided safe hiding, pubs like Jane Bay's over the road. And churches were often used. Revenue men were often quite inept and sometimes corrupt. Would you believe it? A clerk was a bookkeeper, often worked in a bank, church, probably around here, I don't know, or wine merchant, and in at least one case in Lymington, as I mentioned before, the lady worked in the excise office. Even when the Coastguard were officially formed in 1822, it still didn't gain universal approval and respect of the population, having their livelihood interfered with. They didn't quite like that. Following the Royal Committee, appointed by the Prince Regent in 1821, that led to the birth of the Coastguard. The committee was tasked to inquire into every department of the customs, to testify to the flagrant degree of audacity and violence shown by smugglers. The most important recommendation of the committee was that the various preventative forces should be rationalised. There were no fewer than 6 such forces. There were Royal Naval vessels of the coastal blockade, revenue cruisers under Admiralty control, revenue board cruisers, preventative water guard, and riding officers. The overall manpower was some 7,000 members at an annual cost of £500,000 in 1822. Worth nearly 29 million in today's money. This could buy in 1820 the following: 47,619 horses, 100,000 cows, 550,555 stones, that's for building walls and so on, and 87,873 quarters of wheat. Now, search and rescue today costs around 350 million in today's money. That's each year. That includes helicopters and 10 bases around the UK, some 3,500 rescue personnel and around 600 full-time personnel, mostly in the coordination centres. The real Coastguard, in my view, is actually out on the coast, guys that you have in Lymington and so on. The coordination is done in rescue coordination centres of such teams. The cost of an organisation in 1822, if you compare 350 million today with 1822, would have been around 4 million. So not an awful lot. But then they didn't have helicopters in 1822, didn't they? At least, as far as I know, Leonardo da Vinci didn't live in Lymington. The committee sorted through the elements of smuggling bodies and encapsulated the blockade, the preventative water guard, several revenue cruisers and riding officers under the new Board of Customs and Excise and called it the Coastguard. 2 words, Coastguard. No one seems to know why the change from 2 words to 1 word actually happened. My theory is that when they introduced the Coastguard Act in 1925, there was a typing error, and somebody just assumed it was 1 word, and from there on in, it's been 1 word. During its early Coastguard years, Leamington had a complement, and you might be surprised at this, had a complement of 111 coastguards and 23 crew aboard the cutter Active. On the Isle of Wight, there were a further 104 coastguards and 3 further cutters with an overall complement of 42. There was the Stag Rose at Rye, further along the coast, and the Adder at South Yarmouth. And those figures don't include the stations elsewhere around the area, for example, Keyhaven, Christchurch, and so on. So 200 years ago, in January 1822, the Coastguard as we know it today was born. But how did we get from there to where we are now? Our modern concept of Coastguard operations. From rescue rockets to helicopters and drones and semaphore flags to satellite communications and visual watch to computerized search planning. From Coastguard stations like, and I quote from an old Coastguard, fleas on a dog's back. This is just the southeast. And forgive me if you can't read it, but that's the purpose of the slide, because there are so many Coastguard stations there that it's just literally a mess. And if you go around the coast and look at old Ordnance Survey maps, you will see lots of old Coastguard houses and cottages. We're actually awash with them. Every local Coastguard station, there was a cry about the loss of local coastguards every time one closed. However, the closure meant a reduction of regular coastguards in what we would call today the coordination centres. In those days, as of today, the volunteers were still on the ground performing and carrying out the rescues. And people, obviously, they had a misconception. The guys and girls in the rescue centres were the people that came out and carried out the rescue. And then by some magic means went back in and then, closed off the case having coordinated themselves. Bit difficult. It's the volunteers on the coast that make the Coastguard, and they still do. When I joined the Coastguard, and no, not in 1822, 1975, we had what was called a period on the bell, or bell time. And what this actually meant was that there was a single telephone in the Coastguard station office, because we all lived in Coastguard houses on the station. You were not allowed to live in your own house. So you lived on a housing station. And the telephone that was plugged into the station office during the day was taken out and was plugged into the house of the Coastguard who was actually on duty. And you were therefore on the bell. And the reason they called it the bell is because outside the housing stations and the station office was a great big bell that rang, like a big fire bell every time there was a shout. And because of the camaraderie we had in those days, when the bell went off, it wasn't just the duty man who came out. It was almost the entire station to go and carry out the rescue. Yeah. The cottage I lived on the Isle of Wight also had, and I saw this on an antiques programme the other day, a knocker-upper on the window. Years ago in Victorian times, you used to have knocker-uppers that would go around with a big stick and wake people up on their bedroom window. Well, Coastguard cottages had, we were more technical, we had actually things on the top window frame that you could put a stick on, and it would go up and down and bang on the window frame. And and they had those in a museum. I thought it was rather strange. They're still visible in the Isle of Wight cottages. This bell time ceased in the mid to late 1970s with every Coastguard cottage having a telephone. We came alive with technology. and latter the ability of coastguards to purchase their own houses and cottages. Under Mrs. Thatcher's government, the housing scheme allowed people to buy their own council houses, and it naturally fell to coastguard cottages. So coastguards were allowed to buy their own cottage. In some places, the cottages were so remote, I mean, you wouldn't really want to buy it out there, but some places were very nice. The house in Atherfield, the coastguard station on the Isle of Wight, had regular flooding on the floorboards and was so remote nobody wanted to go there anyway. In later years, when coastguard stations were closed, there was this cry again, coastguards moving out of coastguard housing and moving across to elsewhere. But the manpower then was redistributed around rescue centres. And it still is, it's still maintained. Even some years ago, when we closed a number of rescue centres, the manpower from those stations, due to the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, John Prescott, was officially redistributed around the rest of the coast. He wouldn't allow anyone to be made redundant unless they wanted to be. The most notable rescue you may have heard about in this area in the very early days of Coastguard was one of Captain Charles Howe Fremantle. In 1824, who was part of the Coastguard, he received the first gold medal for the rescue of a crew of a Swedish vessel in Christchurch Bay. From the Royal National Institution, he gave for the preservation of life, get that right now, the Royal National Institution for the Preservation of Life from Shipwrecks. Today it's called the RNLI. It's a lot simpler. And he went on to give his name to Fremantle in Australia after he had initially landed there in his HMS Challenger, and you can see it on the slide bottom right, and claimed the land for the British Empire. This is a snap, if I can call it that, of the early 19th century coastguards. It's a station complete with riding officers. You see them on the horseback there. It's not a very good photograph, as you can imagine. It's a very, very old one. It was the forerunner to the vehicle, of course, and mobile lookout and coastguards with mobile cannon to deter smugglers. You no longer have them, I assume, in Leamington. No? But some people could think they could do them from time to time. Of course, the serious business of smuggling and wrecking was about, where they set lamps on the coast to entice ships to wreck on the coast. And the smugglers would wait for them and take their contraband off them. And of course, the preventative officers in the Coast Guard didn't stand a chance. And if they did get anywhere near them, they were lucky if they got out of there alive. Turning now to HM Coast Guard and Rescue, which has been rather ad hoc until 1822 and coincidental with smuggling or anti-smuggling duties, whichever side of the fence you are on. The development of improved technology, as it were, was slow, but around the start of the 19th century, there was this beast came into being. It's called the Mambi Mortar. Basically, what it is a big cannon with a cannonball in it, tied to a chain and then a rope, and it was fired to a shipwreck. Well, the outcome, of course, occasionally might be a further shipwreck rather than, pulling a line on to try and save people. Captain Mambi, having seen ships in distress, invented, or rather converted, a cannon, better described as a mortar, to send a projectile, a cannonball, with a line attached to assist in getting larger hawsers and ropes and a breecher's buoy out to a wreck. This remained in use for a good 5 years, until 1827, until trials proved that rockets could go further and were more accurate than mortar cannon or cannonballs, and a lot less lethal. So the breecher's buoy had new technology in the form of a boxer rocket. And here it is here, resplendent, shaped like a box, with the breecher's buoy to the left, and a resplendent Coast Guard rescue team. They moved on from these boxer rockets to an 84mm rocket, which is a bit bigger, and then they moved on to what they call the rescue rocket. but they were costing a fortune to actually, fire at drills and everything else, so they stopped doing it, and eventually it was phased out. And the breeches buoy went in 1988-89, which is not that long ago, actually, when you think of it. Captain Mambi was also renowned for this. He invented the first mobile fire extinguisher. So that's a rather surprising feature. Now, when I talked about exercising, I don't know, my thing's pointed a bit. There's a man up a pole. Well, that pole is actually what they used to call a wreck post. It simulates a ship's mast, and what they actually do is fire the rocket at it to practice the firing, and then tie a hose around it, and then connect the various lines from the breeches buoy to carry out a simulated rescue. It's quite revealing. Here it is here. He's up the post. Yeah. They were established at each station, and oddly enough, they were part of what they called the Coastguard estate. And the Property Services Agency looked after the Coastguard estate until the 80s and 90s, actually used to pay to the local authority rates for the post, including water rates. Yeah? And in some cases, telephone charges. Until the Coastguard itself took over the role of paying the bills, they discovered that these things were dotted around the coast, and they all had property numbers, and that was the problem. So later they were all taken off the property list so that they could be dealt with properly. But they were on people's land, and eventually they all went. You might see a semblance of one or two around as you go around the coast, but they're most gone. There's a one at Haysborough, which has now gone into the sea, so you won't find that one. But you can see, how they were situated. And that was the way to practice your breeches buoy exercises. As a coastguardsman on the Isle of Wight with my nice little neat battle dress, we received a call one day about a yacht that had run aground on Blackgang Chine. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's got the Smugglers Museum there and so on. This officer, a senior coastguard, and I went off to carry out a rescue, or so I thought. We had all the equipment in our Land Rover, and when we arrived, we were directed down a path to the beach. And we met a sign that said, "No clothes beyond this point." And we thought, some of you may know why that's the case. I don't know. But we had arrived at a local nudist beach. The boss said, "Well, what do we do now, lads?" And a senior colleague said to me, he said, "Well, sir, can I suggest we all get undressed and carry on? But you keep your cap and Wellingtons on so they know who's in charge." Yeah. It's a true story, that, actually. You may have read about it in the News of the World some years ago. Not about the coastguards, of course, but about the yacht and the... Whoops, there we go. This is a 19th century agricultural methods that were used in the Coastguard. And you can see here the Coastguards have got various kit on, and there's one that looks like a deep-sea diver. That was the early form of mud rescue. So thank goodness you don't carry that around anymore. And the black around people's faces are beards, they're not COVID masks. This Victorian lantern slide shows a man having a rope tied around his waist with a bowl in, and he's getting ready to descend a cliff. I'm told it's Beachy Head. Well, if you can imagine Beachy Head just having a rope tied around your waist, that's pretty interesting. And it shows this one here, this sequence. There we are, you can see that. These are Victorian lantern slides, and they're shown in our exhibition over the road in the McCarthy room, so please visit when you can. To be lowered down Beachy Head on a rope took a particular type of person, and I'm pleased to say that that courage and that commitment still exists today in our Coastguard Rescue Service. Because there's lots of things. I was talking to James earlier on, and we were talking about it teaches you something about yourself when you join as a volunteer in a rescue organisation. It teaches you how far you can go and how far you can be pushed. And I'm glad to say there's still a lot of people around who's willing to do it, even though in the 80s I was working in the Coast Guard headquarters and we were pondering the time when we wouldn't have any more volunteers. Well, it just goes to show, doesn't it? There we are. Well, this gentleman here is resplendent in his boater hat, going for a walk along the beach, and his blazer, and he's at odds with the incoming tide, attempting to cling to the cliff, and then descends the cliff. Our Coast Guard descends the cliff to secure the gent and carry on the rescue. And then after all that, regardless of the expense, he goes into a coffee for tea. And finally, a typical Victorian fashion, they all sort of gather around later on and, you know, I'm not even sure whether that guy was involved in the rescue. He probably just popped in for a cuppa. Here's a Coast Guard boat, one of the original ones. And it's been decked out here for a carnival, not Livingston, I hasten to add. It's on the East Coast. And you've seen the various uniform that people had, and you can see in this one here, the ones in the sort of naval type uniform are regular officers, and the ones that aren't in uniform are volunteers as part of the rescue team. James will elaborate later on the role of the volunteer service and so on. At each wreck, or shout as we call it, helpers were given a token, a solid brass token. We've got one over the road in the museum. And the reason they were given this is because afterwards they could deliver it back to the district office or the person in charge and get paid for being there. But sadly, so many people liked the token that they kept them rather than have the money. They're actually worth 120 quid in today's money. But, you know, the one over there is mine. And you can, yeah. Breacher's Buoy, though, remained the first line of rescue for ships in distress. And you may have heard of this ship. It's called the Irex, which was founded on Scratchell's Bay, just to the south of the Needles. And as you can see from the bottom left insert picture, the Irex was carrying railway sleepers and got into trouble during a violent storm in 1890 due to bad visibility, but couldn't be seen from the Needles. The lighthouse on the Needles sent a lamp Morse rescue to the Hurst Light, who in turn sent a telegram to the Coast Guard of Freshwater. The Coast Guard of Freshwater then hired a horse, and off he went up to the Needles Battery, where he was let in by the duty Royal Artilleryman. And upon his arrival, he saw that there was a need for a rescue team. He called out his rescue team, and in fact, what happened is that over 32 people were rescued up 400 feet of cliff over a day and a half by Breacher's Buoy. Quite incredible. This is the Needles Battery, as it was in the 1960s, and you see the grass verge there in front of it. That's where the people who were rescued ended up. Some of them, unfortunately, were left out in the cold because the Royal Artillery duty man decided he'd had enough and he went home and closed the gates. Only to be brought back by the Coast Guard on his horse a short while later. Okay. Later, the whole crew and the Royal Artillery and the helpers were actually introduced to Queen Victoria at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. This is a formal photograph of the motley crew that were involved. I'm sorry for the quality of it, but it's just a very old photograph. The guy in the civvies on the right is actually the area inspector. In typical fashion, he doesn't turn up in uniform, turns up in his civvies. But they look a fair gang there, don't they? No wonder they got involved with smuggling. You couldn't tell the difference. Okay. This is one of the more modern rescue rockets. It's an 84mm rescue rocket, and it's one of the ones that was introduced to replace the Boxer rocket. But of course, as people know, if they've ever fired one of these, either at a wreck or in an exercise, you're safer standing in front of it than you are behind it. Technology moved on. And of course, there you go. Some of the yachts, people amongst you might recognise the Shamuli rocket line that were introduced on yachts and so on, and the Army and I use them extensively. This is a simple sort of expression of the rescue rocket. As far as vehicles are concerned, this is the type of vehicle that was used in the early days, like Corporal Jones from Dad's Army. They used to have to get a guy out to load on the equipment to take it to a scene of a wreck. But during those years, they had no shortage of people who were volunteering these type of trucks. The war years came, of course, and Coastguard played its part. They were on observation duties, and they were also manning lookouts and elsewhere for observation around the coast. There's another nice resplendent gentleman down in Cornwall during the war, keeping a lookout, or rather not, keeping it under his arm. During the First World War, not a lot of people know that Coastguards crewed training ships, losing more than 1,500 men in wartime engagements, and extremely tragic losses. This is Whitby no, it's not. That's Whitby Coastguard Station that was shelled in the First World War. Quite why the Germans decided to shell Whitby Coastguard Station, I don't know. As some people said, it might have carried out £1 million worth of collateral improvement, but you never know. It was shelled repeatedly because the Germans could only get off the East Coast. And of course, sadly, there were funerals held. This one of Mr. Randall, who was killed during one of these raids. During the Second World War, the Coast Guard again came under the authority of the Admiralty, and again for observation, lookout and rescue. And we had the introduction of vehicles. This is the array of vehicles that Coast Guard had over those years. Right down, the bus at the bottom there is not a Coast Guard vehicle, it's for publicity purposes only, going around the coast. Fancy a bus then, Colin? One of those. We had things like Bedford vans, and would you believe it or not, a full set of breeches buoy equipment in a Hillman Imp. So you can see that the fleet has been changed over the years. One of the problems in the early years was that Mrs. Thatcher decided to buy British. You remember the slogan, buy British? Well, we did, and what that meant was, for the money we had, we could only buy British, and that meant Land Rovers. So not every station could have a vehicle. And it wasn't until that was relaxed, when we could buy any vehicle, provided it met the operational purpose, that every station got a vehicle. It was a rather strange. I could see the reason for the buying British, but it didn't actually fit in with our operational needs. A few stations had small boats for patrol purposes, with rescue being ad hoc, In later years, with the significant development and expansion of the RNLI, this became unnecessary in the majority of places, so most of the boat fleet were taken in. And this was the age of the rescue helicopter and advanced communication. This is a quick sequence of a rescue by helicopter, Wessex Mark 4 or 5, I think, off the east coast, where this poor guy, his fishing vessel's turned over, and he's been hauled up like a fish on a strop and delivered to the shore. And you can see the look of relief on his face where he's actually being rescued. And he owes his life to the helicopter and the team. Radio became more commonplace, and Coastguard gained approval in the 80s to be responsible for the distress safety and calling channel, Channel 16. We took this over from what is now BT. And things were moving on. There was also a red telephone for 999 calls and a black one for BT calls. It's quite incredible. We moved on. And we had telex machines where the keystroke was always one behind the actual letter that was on the paper, which caused a lot of confusion, and there were a lot of telexes exchanged with repeated letters. We also introduced whiteboards. This was the essence of technology. And you can see here the Coastguard on the East Coast there with his whiteboard and his little radio to the bottom right with his 6 channels on it and his MF. So he could listen to distress calls that were on MF, but he couldn't do anything about it other than contact the local radio station. So coloured pens and whiteboards were the art form. And then came this. It was the operations room with what they called Radio Communications Distribution Equipment, or RCDE. And it's difficult to get your mouth around that one. And that was the first time we actually had remote radio masts drawing the coast, and all the wiring came into these stations to allow coastguards to actually widen their communications remit and coordinate incidents much further afield from their actual station. But there were flaws in this system. What happened to some of the old guys who were at what we called the day watch stations before they were closing, it was necessary to bring them in to supplement the watch with these communication stations, coordination centres. And I remember one guy came in and he couldn't figure out the kit, so he just went downstairs and read his book. And after about an hour or so, there was a big bang downstairs. Went down to see what it was, and there was the remnants of a steak and kidney pie in its tinfoil container, splattered against the wall. He tried to warm it up in the new microwave. And eventually gave up, and he said, it's one thing if I can't operate the kit. He said, but it's another thing if I can't even warm my lunch up. I'm sure we've all had steak and kidney pie moments with technology. The officer concerned also had, he used to drive a Rhode Island Robin 3-wheeler, because in those days you could drive them without a licence. You had a learner's licence or provisional. And Coastguard did not have a requirement to have a driving licence, strangely enough. So he used to drive a 3-wheeler, and he would travel from his station to incidents, and he would plug in this thing he called his big beam, which was a searchlight, somewhere on the dashboard of this Reliant Robin, and it would last about 2 seconds before it went whack. So we always knew where he was, but we couldn't find him afterwards. That was the problem. The computer age, of course, came in along with with helicopters, and this is the Babbage computer. Would you believe he was working on this when the Coastguard was formed in 1822 with one of his female colleagues called Ada Lovelace. She was the very first computer programmer, female computer programmer. Sue Nelson was actually the first female Coastguard that we had in the Coastguard service. Although, I have to say, I joined with a gentleman who was still a Coastguard when he had a sex change. So I don't know whether that counts, but it's a rather odd situation. Computers are a lot smaller now, of course, and we doubtless remember the introduction of Sinclair's ZX series computers, the BBC Model B kit, and the Commodore 32. Some of you may still have them in your loft. Yeah. So communications and computer technology progressed through the 90s, as did the Coast Guard's concept of operations and organisation. And this led to the restructuring of rescue coordination centres, but not necessarily personnel. Wherever possible, those personnel were redistributed around the area or into other rescue coordination centres. I won't say too much about today's modern Coast Guard because James will cover this. So we got to a stage when we can call the Coast Guard modern, but what will happen in 200 years' time, I don't know. Probably still be volunteers and no regular officers. All of the military machines that were rescue helicopters are now operated by the Coast Guard. We never thought that would happen, certainly not in my lifetime. Well, that's happened. We've got Goonhilly down, where a satellite organisation connects to Falmouth and Inmarsat. So Falmouth can take a 999 call from the east of South Africa and have from a yacht, so they can communicate all over the world. This is our station at Dover, where they look after all the channel navigation traffic, and they get 300 to 500 ship movements a day, and their job is to identify rogues and get them to get out of the way. They are not a policing service as such. They don't tell people where to go and what to do. They simply ensure that the separation zone is safe. And this is a picture of the National Coordination Centre at Fareham, which was to be the fire service station, but they didn't like it because the canteen wasn't big enough. So it's true. It was the Fire Brigades Union said that. And there's another slide which shows it. It's a massive centre, and it has various units that look after various parts of the coast. So you might think you're talking to Humber Coast Guard when you're actually talking to somebody on the desk in Fareham. But that doesn't make any difference because the guys that carry out the rescue are here. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening. And now over to James. I'm sorry that's gone on a little bit, but there you go. Thank you. It's come to bits, James. I'm sorry about that.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. There are lots of friendly faces here, so I'm looking forward to this. I'm going to talk to you for a little, somewhat less time than John did, but I'm going to speak to you for about 15 minutes or so to give you a flavour of the Coast Guard Rescue Service as it is today. I'm going to divide it into roughly 3 parts. I'm going to talk to you about the national structure that John did touch on. I'm going to then talk about your local Coast Guard team, and then more broadly on some of the skills that we use in our rescue techniques. So, to start with, I thought I'd start with this slide, which is just to clarify that we have a statutory duty. We are formed by an Act of Parliament, and our statutory duty, our area of responsibility, is what's described as the littoral area, and that is the beach and the beach and the cliffs around it. We also, of course, have responsibilities for people in distress at sea. And the reason why I say this is that our whole approach now is very multi-agency. We work very closely with the fire brigade, the police, the hazardous areas rescue teams, and all those types of things. And we have to have primacy over the littoral area. I'm now coming on to the national part of the operations, and this is a complicated slide, and I won't dwell on it too much, other than to say that if you look at the script on the left, our whole ethos and our whole system revolves very much around volunteers. I'm very proud of that. And we've got some 3,200 Coast Guard rescue officers, and maybe 200 or 300 full-time officers as well. There are a total of about 350 to 400 Coast Guard rescue teams all the way around the country. And 200 of those are trained in rope rescue techniques. Another 50 are trained in mud rescue. And there are 17 teams that have both those technical disciplines. And you'd be very interested to know that Lymington is one of those 17 teams. I'm now going to draw it down a little bit, and on our last slide you see we're now in Area 9. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Lymington Coast Guard team itself. On that map, it's not absolutely strictly correct because it's a couple of years old. The Southampton Coast Guard rescue team is no longer with us, and their area is now looked after by our flank team to the east, which is Hill Head. And we look after an area of coast from about Chewton Bunny to the Itchen Bridge. It's about 30 miles of coast, and it's very varied. In one area, we've got an urban responsibility, an urban coastline, docks, right the way through to busy beaches, as we all know. We have a total of 13 Coast Guard rescue officers. And our total amount that we are able to have is 14, so we're almost fully manned. We rely on two 4x4 vehicles, Nissan Navaras, which are quite heavy with all the kit in. In fact, they're right up on their maximum axle weight, together with a trailer. And we're based in Burton Boatyard, as I'm sure many of you know. We have one full-time Coast Guard rescue officer who's called a SCOO, and the service is absolutely littered with acronyms, I'm afraid, but anyway. He's a senior coastal operations officer, and he looks after 3 to 4 teams. I thought it might be helpful or interesting for you to get a little bit of a breakdown about the amount of call-outs we have. And this is our 2021 figures, 151 call-outs. And they vary, as you see, from investigations which may be just something's washed up on the beach, or someone think they spotted a red flare and we go and investigate that, right the way through water rescues, medical evacuations. We do quite a lot of stretcher carry-outs for the ambulance service, risk watch patrols, and that would be where we're deploying our assets to clifftop and to beach positions in anticipation of a major event such as the Round the Island race. Rope rescues, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Ordnance, as you all know, there are an awful lot of unexploded items that wash up from time to time on Hurst Spit. And then mud rescue, which I'll talk about in greater detail, missing persons, and we just had one immigration call last year. Against this, the total number of call-outs for that same period in 2020 was 33,000 across the whole nation. So they're getting nearly 100 a day. It makes you think, doesn't it? Moving on now to the rescue disciplines. All Coast Guard teams, all Coast Guard rescue officers have some standard disciplines and skills, which are search and rescue techniques and also water safety and rescue. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in greater detail. This battery is falling out, but anyway, sorry. And then, depending upon the local area, we'd be trained in technical disciplines, which would be rope rescue, mud rescue, and in some cases, flood rescue as well. These are the standard disciplines that we've got. Where am I? Sorry, that hasn't. There we go. These are the standard disciplines that we've got, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but on the left-hand side, most of them are fairly straightforward and things that you'd expect us to do. I will, though, just draw attention to the helicopter operations. we, as volunteer officers, aren't actually aboard the helicopters, but our skill lies in identifying places which we can put the helicopter safely down. We know what it's required, and the pilots tend to talk to us and are happy with our choices. Not always, but most of the time. I haven't got time to talk a great deal about the helicopters, but as John said, we have a total of 20 helicopters, 10 Sikorsky S-92s, and those of you who are involved with helicopters know that's quite a heavy lift helicopter, which are in the north of England, on bases there, particularly in view of issues that may happen on oil rigs and gas rigs. Down here, the one you see overhead is an Augusta Westland 189, which is got less of a lift capacity, but is more nimble and very fast. We also get involved with lost and missing persons. The difference between a lost and a missing person, well, a missing person will know where he is, but we don't. Whereas a lost person, he doesn't know where he is, and neither do we. They're a bit more tricky. We handle time-expired pyrotechnics, and we work with the explosive ordnance disposals as well. Water rescue. Don't think Baywatch. We don't do Baywatch. Okay. We really we look after the area between where an inshore lifeboat can get in. They can get in quite close to the shore. We just look after the surf. And we'll rescue people from there. We'll always be tethered to the shore. So we won't be bounding down the beach with a torpedo boy behind us. I'll talk a little bit about mud rescue now. Mud rescue is the most challenging physical thing that we do. It's immensely hard work. We deploy onto the mud, dragging the sledges that you can see. We also have some more sophisticated kit, a raft as well. We have extraction techniques which involve digging and also lances that we can put down alongside a stuck foot or a stuck limb to release the suction. It does say on this that we deploy from a helicopter. I've never found a pilot prepared to actually have us in our mud gear and all the dirt in a helicopter, but we do it. I have got a prop. This is an example of something that's actually a really good bit of kit. And in general, the Coastguard kit that we get these days is very good. This is an American wildfire's galosh, basically, which is what we use. And when we tread on the mud, this thing splays like this, and as it comes up, it releases the mud and you move on. It works absolutely perfectly in the right sort of mud. In the wrong sort of mud, no good at all. We have, of course, a rope rescue capability, and the Lymington team, the cliffs are over towards Barton, and we do have a number of issues there with hang gliders and that sort of thing getting into trouble on those cliffs. We can deploy with just 2 people, in which case we can go over the side, secured on holdfast into the top of the cliff, and we descend. With only 2 people, we descend, stabilize the casualty, and take them down to the base of the cliff. With a full team, we can then recover back up to the top as well. And indeed, we can take stretchers down there, and I've got some pictures in a moment or two of that. We also get involved with gecko pickoff. I don't know if many of you know what a gecko pickoff is. Can I ask you to cast your mind back to those halcyon days on the beaches when you were a child in August, and your mother was looking after you, and you're thinking, and you wander off and you see a nice little rock or some rock cliffs to climb up, and you start going up quite happily, and you get to that stage where everything's going swimmingly well until you look down, and then you decide you can't go down. And you're stuck, and you're frozen, and then you become a gecko. And geckos are extremely difficult to rescue in a satisfactory way. What you don't want to do is to be abseiling down to them, because the first thing they'll do is they'll grab your foot. And at that stage, the rescue gets very complicated. The idea actually is to go along the side and talk to them and reassure them, and then come back underneath them and wedge your knee between their thighs, basically, and hold them like that. Anyway, I just throw that in for what it's worth. I'm now coming, so this is a very brief run through it. I'm now coming towards a few pictures of the local team. Here we are, water training, swift water rescue, and we're in a river here, and the technique is to support each other in order that you don't actually get swept down as a whole. There's a lovely day at the top of the cliffs in Barton. Again, your local team, your Lymington team, supported by Southbourne in this instance. And what I'd like to draw attention to here is that in the background you can see there's a paramedic and indeed a helicopter pilot. It's another example of multi-agency rescues that we now get increasingly involved with. You must think we only go out when the sun shines, actually, looking at these pictures. Here's a stretcher rescue, again, all the people at the top, the coastguards at the top, would have their harnesses on and be tethered to the holdfasts at the top, so they can't fall over as well. Here's mud rescue using these mudders, these American mudders, quite effectively, and they're going off. We train and re-qualify every year on this particular skill. So I didn't want to spend too much time, but this really just gives you a little bit of a flavour about the sort of things that we do. And all I'd leave you with is that we try very much never to be judgmental, and if you can imagine on occasions when somebody has a man who maybe is not very experienced, has a new yacht, and he's taking his family out and his mother-in-law and his children for the first time, and things don't actually go that well, and he's run out of diesel and he's swept up on the shingle bank, and the lifeboat's gone out, and his family are rather frightened, and he's lost a lot of credibility. We're asked to go down and give him a bit of a safety briefing and that sort of thing. And from my own personal experience, what I find is that the man is looking, oh no, not another two people in uniform coming down the pontoon. I really can't handle this today. And I tend to go up to them with a big smile. And I say, sir, we've seen an awful lot worse than this. And on that note, I'll leave it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, both John and James. Very interesting and very informative. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Go on, I want some barracking from the... Oh.
Sorry, is it a question?
Are you a volunteer?
A question. Yes, I'm a volunteer. We're all volunteers. Everybody here tonight. Yeah.
Who trains the helicopter pilots, please?
Oh, I could talk a bit more about that. The helicopters are, it's a contract held by Bristow's. So Bristow's provide the helicopters and the pilots.
Do you tend to get ex-members of the RAF joining you?
Again, that they are actually employees of Bristow's. So I imagine yes is the answer.
In what circumstances do you find you need mud rescue?
Oh, quite frequently, and actually more so now. It could be somebody, for instance, recently in Keyhaven, we had a couple of gentlemen who were inspecting their boats separately after the strong winds that we had 2 or 3 weeks ago. And they were so busy inspecting their boats, they didn't notice the tide went out. and they then try to get ashore, and they find they can't, and then they get cold and that sort of thing, and then we have to go and do it. So it's circumstances such as that.
Right. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Yes, Juliet. Sorry. No.
Thank you. A few years ago, as a little background, a few years ago we were on holiday in Cornwall, and one of the places we visited, I can't remember where, was a Coastguard watch station, which was then manned by volunteers who, I'm not sure whether they were directly connected with you or not. I'm not sure how that works now.
Thank you, sir. That's a very good point. That's an organisation called Coastwatch, which has been running for the last 15 years or so, where in brief, the old Coastguard, some of the old Coastguard watchouts, which is like Calshot Tower, for instance, and there's one on the Needles and there's one at Hengistbury Head. These old stations weren't being used. And a number of retired people said, well, look, we'll get some eyes out there during the summer days. And it's burgeoned, and it's a very useful organisation, Coastwatch. They're separate to us, and they're volunteers as well. Sorry, Juliet. I can hear you, Juliet.
Probably all come from different walks of life, but do you have a fair number of ex-military people who join you?
That's an interesting question. We are very diverse. I'm looking in front of them now. We all have a whole range of different skills and diversity and do different things in our lives. I think I'm the only one with a military background at the moment, but I'm not certain. I think so. So not necessarily is the answer.
What's the ratio of women in the service?
We would dearly love to have more women. I speak from my experience in the team. We have had ladies in the team before. We haven't got any ladies at the moment. They bring a very important, compassionate element to any of our rescues, and we would like to get lady volunteers.
There is actually it's a ratio of about 3 men to 1 woman in the Coast Guard at large, and the director of Her Majesty's Coast Guard is a woman.
Thank you. One more. Right. I see. So you're asking how do we secure it at the top of the cliff? It's a series of stakes, and there was one picture towards the end of one of the photographs. There are stakes about that long, which are banged in, and they're banged in tandem. So the top of the first stake is secure to the bottom of the next stake, and in that way they are very secure. I've never known them or any circumstances where they've moved. Well, I assure you, madam, they're not.
In the old days when we had Land Rovers, the Land Rovers had a capstan winch on the front. So the cliff man was attached to the capstan winch, which sent them over the cliff, and the Land Rover was staked into the cliff with the same method that we use.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
One more.
I can't get one.
Yes.
Do you get involved with that, or is that all the lifeboat?
No. So that's a two-part question, really. It's Border Force who look after the immigration issue that we have further to the east. We're not involved with that. The particular incident that we had last year was where an inflatable, which had already been emptied successfully by Border Force, and it ended up on the beach at Milford. And it was quite interesting because the last thing Border Force don't actually take those vessels themselves on board, because all they do is they put a number on them, they spray a number. And the first thing that we were asked by our ops room is, what's the number on the boat? And so we were able to relay it off, and they were able to cross-compare it and say, yes, we got all those people off, we'll come and pick it up tomorrow.
The situations in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, are they all within the Her Majesty's Coastguard, or are they managed separately?
No, it's all within Her Majesty's Coastguard, all the countries that you mentioned, the nations that you mentioned, yeah. Again, Trinity House is a separate organisation that looks after the lighthouses and the buoyage. They're not. They're a separate organisation to us. Thank you.
Can you please tell us what the coverage is of the helicopters stationed along the south coast?
Yes, I can. Leon Solent. And then we go down. Can you help me here? Newquay. There are 10 all the way around the country, and I think there's one up towards Dover as well.
Each helicopter base.
Sorry? Lid. That's right. Lid. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. It's above my pay grade, really, I'm afraid.
Each helicopter base is located so that it has a furthest on circle. So it can get to anywhere around the UK coast and out to sea around the UK search and rescue region without there being a gap. So the helicopter coverage is literally nationwide.
What is the diameter of that circle?
Where are you
People are vested interest.
There are actually furthest on circles depending on the speed of the helicopter and the endurance, rather, of the helicopter. Most of that could be about 120 miles. But they usually set it at 30 to 60 miles, depending on, what sort of coverage they dictate at any given time of the day or the night.
May I ask, does that include the Channel Islands then from Leon Solent?
Yeah, the Leon Solent chopper's been over to the Channel Islands on lots of occasions. I mean, the French Search and Rescue Organisation is a subject all its own.
Right. I've never known so many questions. That's great. And it's a terrific turnout tonight, so I hope you all get home safely. I would like to conclude with a big thank you to you both. I think it's been a most interesting evening. And next talk will be the history on the High Street, and Steve Marshall, our lovely curator, will be with us to talk about the High Street and its history. That'll be on the, and this is no joke, the 1st of April. So thank you to all you gentlemen for looking after us so safely. And finally to you two. Thank you very much indeed.